I'm Blair Davis. I am a professor of media and cinema studies at DePaul University in Chicago, and I teach film history, media history, comic studies, comic book movies, and B movies. And I've written a few books in those general areas. And in comic studies, books like Comic Book Movies, Movie Comics Page to Screen, Screen to Page, Comic Book Women, and my newest book, Christianity in Comics. So I'm really interested in large historical multi-decade narratives, but also digging in the corners to see what needs to kind of be reclaimed and trumpeted. And that's sort of where my interest in Alvin Hollingsworth stemmed from. I really became interested in his career and his visual aesthetics in particular, as well as the trajectory of his life, from working in comics to working in avant-garde art, and then becoming a professor later on in his life. I wrote my particular research question down so I didn't get it wrong. Specifically in my essay, I'm really interested in the idea if we can trace any sort of patterns, visual patterns, thematic patterns, and aesthetic patterns of an avant-garde artist's life, if we can trace that backwards through earlier work in the comics medium, how can we use that pattern not only to elevate this sort of understudied artist, particularly within the early work in comics, how can we also use that to draw attention to what the medium of comics is capable of somebody that does early work and then goes on to do fine art, so to speak. My entry point into it, I didn't know a lot about Hollingsworth's career until just a few years ago. I'm sure there's many sort of golden age comics collectors that would trace his work from title to title, but for most comics readers, even most comics fans, the further back you go from modern era to bronze to silver to the golden age, not everyone is familiar with the more than just sort of the most well-known titles. In other words, there is just so many comic book series, so many creators that have really sort of gone unheralded, unnoticed over the decades, to the point where there's this sort of meta history that is understood about how comics began, and you hear the names of Jack Kirby and Will Eisner and Stan Lee, and if you're lucky, Matt Baker. And there's a handful of creators that are very, very well known, and then there are hundreds more that most people have never heard of. And same with comics titles. Most people know Action Comics and Detective Comics, and even maybe Marvel Comics, and they might have read some Archies. But for the average comics reader in like the 1940s, for example, there were hundreds of other titles that they were exposed to on a daily, weekly basis. And so most of that has sort of been lost to the ages. And so to go back and look at a creator like Hollingsworth is to really sort of consider comics as a fandom process, comics as an industry in the way that people would have at the time, not in terms of this grand history that has now been sort of understood, but Hollingsworth as this person who was making a career in the 40s and 50s. But then to look specifically at what he is doing is really interesting, as with other creators that I've looked at, like Lily Renee, for example, as a pioneering female artist. Hollingsworth and Renee both had particular art styles that I've traced that sort of anticipate the work of later, very, very recent popular creators, like in the case we'll look at in a moment, Mike Mignola, Jay Lee, Tim Sale. And then with Renee, I see parallels in how she draws women, for example, with the work of John Byrne and Todd McFarlane, really sort of long, angular faces and limbs and big, wide eyes. And you do a side-by-side and you go, that's sort of ahead of its time. So to trace this sort of maybe it's not pioneering in that it directly influenced, but it is a definite precursor to later trends that became very sort of popular and imitated by later artists. So you go back and celebrate the work that was being done, and it elevates the art form, and it elevates the work of so many neglected creators. Is from Eerie, which was a very popular horror series at the time. And he uses this approach on a regular basis in many of his horror comics, of the eyes being these sunken pits within these deep dark recesses,
Mhm.
which digging around, it was not a common visual trait. I'm sure some might say, oh, but in this issue I saw this. Hollingsworth uses this approach quite regularly in his horror series and some of his crime series in a way that really all of a sudden reminded me of what Mignola is doing in Hellboy. And then the sort of Mignolaverse industry of artists working in that style. It's kind of become a visual shorthand for gothic H.P. Lovecraft types of horror in modern genre storytelling that I see Hollingsworth doing quite regularly with lots of skulls, for example, which is a Mignola trademark. And Hollingsworth was really interested in this distortion and exaggeration of what bodies are. And then that previous slide with the zombie uh, really shows this, yeah, this real interest in using genre tropes within the horror genre to play around with what human bodies can look like, distorted or rotting or otherwise. And that's something that stuck with him as he moved forward into later movements, doing figurative expressionism in series like The Prophet, where you've got the human body just broken down into what almost looks like little matchstick type figures, and it's an outline literally jagged, and he pioneered that approach within his work for comics.
So this is an interesting juxtaposition because I wonder if, with Orms, because she was in many ways, a public figure, or at least had a public identity before she, or as she was also working on her comic art, we are, inclined to want to link her and the work. Whereas from what you said before about Hollingsworth, part of his duty in taking on these genres was to blend in and bring some of his distinctive, aesthetic style, but to blend in with the house style, to fit in with the different conventions and tropes of the genre. So in some ways, being invisible was sort of part of the talent, right? So it feels like it's a interesting way that we now view them given those circumstances.
And I mean, that's how you get your next assignment, is to give somebody what they've asked for on this assignment, but still ideally, put a little bit of yourself into it, which in this case then I found it really valuable to really emphasize formal analysis in
Right.
this. I was bringing in some aspects of representation, but it became more about how do we make a case about Hollingsworth, the artist. And so in that case, very close formal reading, which as a comic scholar was fun for me to dig into line work in real detail, shadows. Yeah.